Morning, Dan.
How you doing?
All right. How are you?
Good, good. I'm looking for a good book on the Hanseatic League.
Sorry, on the what?
On the Hanseatic League. I've gone down a rabbit hole. I was thinking this, I was looking into, I'm starting to publish all my primary sources onto Substack, and I got through the first one is always for American history is always the Leif Erikson one. But then after that, I thought I would say something about everybody who went out into the North Atlantic to fish cod between the Vikings and Columbus, right? Because there's that whole Mark Kurlansky couple of books, the one about the Basques and then the one about cod itself, and the idea that there's a whole lot of activity going on in the North Atlantic, and maybe that's how Columbus finds out that there's something out there to go to and all that. So I've been sort of fascinated by that whole train of conspiracy thinking, I guess you might call it, in the on the fringes of history. Hey, Tim. And so I've been thinking, and then I've just finished for the first time ever, I've just finished teaching ancient and medieval world history. And I thought, maybe as a bridge from medieval to modern world history, I should spend a little bit of time talking about that period in the North Atlantic. And then I thought, well, I've never really read a good book about the Hanseatic League. So I'm looking, so I just asked, and I've been using Grok 3 quite a bit this morning. I just asked it to come up with some good recent books. And I said, well, there aren't any really, and it kind of responded and said, there aren't any really recent ones. But then I said, okay, if they're not recent, what are the best ones? And I've been going back and forth. Actually, I did a screen recording of it thinking about some questions I was asking it about finding sources for especially these. There are a bunch of books that don't exist anymore. There's a book called Inventio Fortunata, which is the fortunate discovery or something that is supposed to have been written by a Franciscan friar associated with Oxford in the 1360s to 1380, after King Edward III sent them out to explore and report on the North Atlantic. And it's mostly one of those fabulous stories of, doesn't have any one-legged people, but it does have dwarves, and it has men with very large feet, and it has an island, a metallic island at the North Pole, which attracts, is what attracts all of the compass needles and all that kind of stuff. But it's referred to, although we don't have a copy of it anymore. It's referred to in several other documents and sort of paraphrased, and things are cited from it, and that sort of thing. So I was going down this
So
this
it's
rabbit hole.
so it's very much of a hippie dragon.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And there's a map that was apparently there are apparently a couple of Venetians named Niccolo and Antonio Zeno who apparently went to Iceland at least, and possibly to Greenland, and possibly even as far as North America, at least according to their descendant, Niccolo Zeno the Younger, who published what purported to be their letters to each other, the two brothers, and also a map that they supposedly made, which has Norway. It has kind of on the right, it has, sort of the Norse lands, and then it has Iceland and Greenland. And then it has this giant fabulous island of Friesland, which doesn't really exist, which is in about where the Faroe Islands are. But then way to the left in the southwest corner, there are two little other land masses called Estotiland and Drogeo, which could be Labrador and Newfoundland. Although this was published after all of those things were discovered and mapped by all the people that we know about. So this may be sort of retroactive bullshit. So it's interesting. It's interesting to kind of just to mess around with. What I was doing was I was actually going to put there's one more primary source that I'm going to kind of stick in there, which is a letter from a guy named John Day in Bristol to Christopher Columbus in 1498, where he mentions that Columbus had asked him, and that's how I came up with the 14th century book Inventio Fortunata, because Columbus asked him to procure him a copy, and Day says, well, I thought I had a copy and I thought it was being sent to me, but apparently it didn't arrive, so I don't have it. So So there's and then Day talks to him about Cabot and what he found, when he went, and this was written like the year that Cabot came back. So this would be 1498. And he talks, and really kind of tells Columbus, yeah, we knew about North America. Basically implies that, this is often used as, especially by the people in Bristol, as a way of saying, yeah, we were there.
Yeah, I mean, two things strike me for this. One is the really unique position of Iceland versus Greenland,
Mm-hmm.
where Greenland is both north and south and east and west of Iceland,
Yeah.
and there is a nominally full-scale reproduction of one of the Nina Pinta Santa Maria is turning up in the UK this summer.
Really? Is it being
And
there from someplace?
I don't know where it's come from. I had a
It's like the tall ship's only smaller.
but yeah. It's a very small tall ship.
Yeah.
No,
I
it's
remember
turning
I
up.
remember when I was a kid and the tall ships came to New England. That was cool.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I saw them in Oslo and they were fucking huge. I mean, it's not that big a walk, stroke, public transport trip for me to go see the Cutty Sark, and then
Right.
I did a whole summer in Portsmouth, so HMS Victory, etc. But there's a photographer friend of mine keeps us up to date with new buildings and other fun things to do in London with a camera sort of thing. So there's the Santa Rosa Maria or Santa Maria, whatever, clone.
Mhm.
He's turning up in St Catherine's Dock in the Docklands of London sometime this summer. So I sent him a link to the picture that I've given you of Zenghi's junk
Mhm. Yeah.
versus one of the. And
Yeah, that's the
unfortunately,
Santa Maria in front of it, isn't it? Yeah.
yeah, it was
One of them.
all three of them are about the same
They're
size. So
little caravels, yeah.
but it led me down the rabbit hole of exactly what is a carrack and where did it come from and stuff. And then, of course, there's obviously the quick reminder of we don't actually really know how big Zenghi's ships were. And the
Yeah,
one that
I read that book by Dreyer, I think it was, where there's a little bit of confusion about converting the measurements.
well, there's always that sort of problem.
Yeah.
This cubit is different to your cubit and
Mhm.
all the rest of it. Anyway, but the one that I like in terms of trying to say these ships must have been X amount of size because this is the dockland of a shipyard it was built in.
Right.
And the shipyard is nicely long enough, except it's not really wide enough or deep enough. So it's like
They were built
4 or
around
5 meters,
they,
4 or 5 meters deep,
yeah.
and 10 to 15 meters wide, but several hundred meters long. And it's like,
Yeah, those books are like those big ones. The treasure fleet was like 265 feet wide. Those big flagships.
Yeah. So that's the assumption based on some of the descriptions in Chinese.
Yeah.
And then of course there's all the fantasy from whatever his name is, that British naval captain that has done the Zenghi fleet stuff on the tour.
1415, the time, the year
but
America and all that. Yeah. I haven't read any of
it. I've sort of skimmed it a couple of times in the bookshop type thing.
Mhm.
But it comes over as being if I ignore most of the dots, I can join some of the dots up like this.
You can see a constellation if you squint.
Yeah. And I quite like the way some things sort of come back around and then you were talking about the Hanseatic Federation, I suppose you've called it in the now, because it was a disparate, uncontinuous set of states that were all held together by a
Mhm.
commercial
Right.
strife.
And, and that's one of
But
the things that I thought was interesting about it as I started thinking, well, maybe I should dig into this a little bit more because this is we don't because it doesn't find its way, I think, because I was sort of wondering, why isn't this in more, traditional kind of mainstream world histories? And I think it's because it does sort of go against the grain of that, oh, we're consolidating now into nation states, right? And this is the big innovation of Europe, and this kind of goes in the opposite direction in some way, at least.
yeah, well, but, I mean, the other thing that came up in literally going the other way was either this week or last week, so I'm not sure, but the hour-long bit from Rory Stewart and Alistair on their
Mm,
podcasts. They they've got one that talks a bit about where they made the podcast. Then India and Pakistan had some fisticuffs with fighter aircraft, and then they published it the day after. So he said, "Don't complain, but we did this day before yesterday or whatever it was."
right. It
And but
all has to
within
be
there,
rewritten.
yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that because they're not broadcasting live in inverted commas most of the time, there'll always be a bit of a lag, and when some things are actually real time happening, you kind of get caught out. But anyway, they had this is their sort of typical hour long, and they do like 5 or 6 questions from people that write in. But somebody had put in the question about citizens' assemblies, as in if part of the problem is nobody really trusts politicians anymore, and of course because it's not really an American program, it's focused a bit more at Europe, and Europe has had a number of instances where one-off citizens' assemblies have been used to crack a hard nut.
Mhm.
And I mean, the obvious big one is abortion and they literally sort of went through the electoral roll and picked out 300 people, stuck them in a room for 2 weeks, and alongside with coffee and donuts sort of thing, they had a couple of hundred experts to chew the fat with it. And they come out with a relatively practical solution. Rory then picked up that that's how a lot of things get sorted in Switzerland.
Mm.
But it hasn't really caught on. But he could see not so much replacement of the House of Lords for that, but maybe a third chamber that would,
The house of people who do the background reading.
yeah. But it would be a case of we the people have decided this is sorry, we the people have decided this is an expected solution to that problem that you gave us because you weren't brave enough to stand up or clever enough to sort it out, or no blame attached, but you didn't do your fucking job, so we did it.
Mhm.
Therefore, you have to take it through the next stages. So it's they're not expecting the citizens' assembly to write the legislation, and they're not necessarily expecting them to be the final deciders. But you could have a damn good reason for not following the direction.
Yeah.
And that seemed to be quite a good idea. And it's clearly one of those things that they want to come back to in the program. So
Mhm.
I should be trying to keep an eye out for that.
Well, it would
So
be, I mean, and it would seem like that was probably what, all these, subcommittees and blue ribbon commissions and all of those things were originally designed for before they became just opportunities for people to grandstand in front of TV cameras and get their 20 or 30-second sound bites that they could use to go back and appeal to their base for contributions for the
yeah,
next
I and I
election.
and I and I did wonder how much the fact that we can now see this,
Hmm.
how much that helps or hinders.
Yeah.
as opposed to we actually get decent, relatively unbiased reporting. I mean,
Well,
there are still some inquiries in the UK that are
yeah.
not so much behind closed doors, but no cameras.
Well, yeah,
Um,
and at the very least, it would seem like that would give people a little bit more space to
yeah.
try out ideas that they don't necessarily want on the 5 o'clock news.
Well, it comes. See, Chris can't do it. It comes up in a number of West Wing quotes. Let's do this behind closed doors because we'll never survive out in the real world otherwise.
Mhm.
And
Well,
one of them social security for the US.
yeah. Well, in terms of the stuff that we were reading this week, that whole that whole kind of cognitive capture section of Plutocrats, where she's talking about, actually, I think at that point, about the Fed, and how could Greenspan get it so wrong, and all of that, how could he be so dumb when we thought he was so smart, and it's all sort of, I think, weirdly part of that issue of managing appearances rather than sort of demonstrating that you've got any kind of grip on the reality. And I think Greenspan was always great at that. I mean, he was managing appearances really early in his career when he was writing essays for Ayn Rand's Virtue of Selfish, and establishing his cred on the gold standard side and all of that. I don't know. It seems like it was much more about the appearance of authoritative expertise than it was actually showing any results.
Well, one of the things I can't remember now whether it was like this week's read or last week's cited for the other book, the second book, or his chapter 4,
Yeah, let me go back over to that one.
keeping the rich brackets filthy rich and the poor brackets dirt poor.
Huh?
The one, and there's this guy who I didn't know who he was, whose name I forgot, but is another French guy, but is Serez, Saez.
Oh, yeah. Edmund.
He's
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. So, Emmanuel or Edmund, something. Yeah, he comes over as being very much of a Piketty disciple, I suppose,
Mhm. I think
and has done quite a bit of common,
the kind of
publications work.
Gini coefficient stuff, wasn't it?
Yeah, but income inequality reaches records and
Mhm.
threatens American dream, for instance.
Yeah.
And I just go back to Terry Pratchett and the $35 shoes versus the $50 boots. The cost of being poor, if you've never been, is huge.
Mhm.
And the other one that I think of outside of Terry Pratchett, another British woman who was a single homeless parent at one point,
Mhm.
but then managed to get on really well with a blog that doesn't do anything anymore, which is a bit of a shame. But she concentrated really on how to manipulate your food shopping to maximize your food variance and capacity, but without a fridge. And because
Mhm.
if you're homeless, you don't necessarily know that your cupboard is suddenly going to be a bag,
Right.
etc.
Yeah, which would seem to push you, which would seem, unfortunately, to kind of push you to the center aisles of the supermarket, where all of the stuff is extremely shelf stable, but also not really that good for you.
Yeah, yeah. I sort of pre-mixed side beans, stroke spaghetti, stroke pork sausage, in
Stroke
whatever.
Doritos.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And there was a few other bits on for the UK. If you were a poor payer of your utilities, they would put you on what is effectively a prepaid meter. So you pay today for tomorrow's electrical gas. And you go back to like the 60s, there were literally coin-operated meters
Right.
that would 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 ring a bell to say you've got like 30 minutes of gas left.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know where this has come from. It was fine about an hour ago.
Hmm.
And the annoying thing with the coin buttons, of course, is you have to have the right size coin. So have you got a sixpence or have you got a shilling for the meter? It
Mhm.
used to be one of the things you'd go round and ask next door to for
Oh,
instead
wow.
of like a have you got a bit of
Mm.
sugar I can have type thing, which was the usual. Let's break the ice with the neighbour saying, I've got a
Sure.
spare little bowl of sugar. Do you need some sugar type thing? So they came out with these plastic keys that have got effectively a credit card strip inside them. So you go to your shop, give them your key, and they would load it for a couple of quid. They should give you like a week's worth of gas or electricity. I don't think anybody did it on the water meter,
Hmm.
but there might be, or at least there might be now, because I haven't lived in the UK for almost 20 years now. But one of the policy unit type social study groups worked it out that to buy your utility, as in gas or electric, that way was at least 8% more expensive. And it's like here, I get a decent high-end credit card, and it gives me automatic 5% discount on all the food
Right.
I buy, whether it's at the grocery store or at a restaurant, or even at McDonald's.
Do you mean in
But
terms, it's more expensive in terms of cost, or it's more expensive in terms of that they can stick it to you that way? That basically they can
oh, but the eight
jack up
percent
all of the fees
is
and all of that stuff. Yeah.
is a cost for the energy delivered. Yes,
Mhm.
and it's not so much that the shop is charging you a fee to load up, but like a pound's worth of gas equivalent is like £1 tempered. So they're biasing the meter. And back in the day, the landlord would own the meters very often. And so they would be the ones to clean out the coinage, so they'd wind them up.
Yeah.
So and back in the day when it was a telephone that was in the corridor or the hallway or the stairway for a block of flats, that was a big house that's now somebody said, oh, I own my I've got Dad's house. I don't need it. I don't want it, but I don't want to sell it.
Mhm.
So I'll make it into 20 flats. And
Right.
you could, partly because the water meter is relatively, or used to be relatively rare, but what you do find is the water ball puts the valve to turn you off outside of the pavement.
Mm.
So you'd have this one house that was like a 5-6 story Georgian pucker house. I mean, all of a sudden, you look outside the front door down the steps where they had a semi-basement garden flat sometime,
Mhm.
and outside in the footpath in the pavement, there's like 25 water stopcocks, which have got a relatively small manhole cover, which is basically a cover to put a stick down to turn the valve on.
Right.
And you go round, particularly places like Notting Hill, from the famous film, and there'll be loads of them
Mhm.
down the road. How they actually guaranteed they got the right one, I never know. But anyway, there would be a number of instances where, because you didn't have much choice, you would always be paying slightly over the market rate.
Mhm.
And because you don't stay put for very long, you get tagged as a poor financial risk. So
Mhm.
you're always on the worst tariff anyway, etc., etc., etc.
Mhm.
Here they don't do that because it's a monopoly supply. So there is, unless you get into a supersized industrial, or like I was back when I was working at the hotel, you get everybody's on the same rate. And some of the older buildings, they don't even meter the cooling, they just do it by the square meters.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got no incentive to turn your thermostat up rather than have it down all the way down at 17 degrees, freeze your ass off because you can, which is a bit disappointing. But all the new places are all on smart meters, so that they don't even have to come and read them anymore.
Yeah. No.
There's another job gone.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, well, yeah, it's funny. Jobs come and go. I'm in an old apartment building here. It was built about, I don't know, 110 years ago or so, and so
Oh,
so we've got I've got I think it's hot. I think it's actually hot water, not steam radiators. But I have no thermostat, so it's just when the heat's on, the heat's on. If it gets too hot, you open the window. So that's just what it is. One of the things that struck me this week, though, if I can change the subject a little bit, is and it was partly the stuff in the that we were reading, but it was also partly I started watching. I noticed this person, Batya Ungar Sargon, who is apparently, she's kind of, her star is rising in the blogosphere or the podcastosphere, I guess. Podcastistan, I guess they're calling it now. And she made an interesting distinction. Apparently, she's written two books recently. She wrote a book a couple of years ago about how bad the media is, but her recent book that just came out is sort of about regular people in America. And she went around America apparently and looked at sort of working class and interviewed working class people. And she tries to make this distinction between the poor and the working class, which I thought was kind of interesting and was a different way of looking at it because she's trying to, I guess, understand, where the impulse comes from for populism and how it differs from left to right, from left populism to right populism. And one of the and part of her response to that is, that it doesn't really break along the lines that the pundits suggest that it does. Her name is, I'll get you the title.
We've recently had the local elections in the UK,
Mm-hmm.
and we've all got like 600 seats in the local council.
It's
But
called,
the Green Party still got 8,000 plus seats in council. So it's not really much to shout about, but Reform are very good at shouting.
mm,
But it's also, if you think of Reform as being the polite side of British fascism, stroke racist party, but their major, their manager, fundraising type manager, is actually a first generation Sri Lankan.
mm,
So his parents, one was a doctor, one was a nurse. They came over in the 60s or 50s, part of them from Windruck.
mm,
It's about the same, the right period. He went to, eventually ended up at London School of Economics, and he is a sort of capital fund venture capitalist type person. So therefore, as brown as you can get without being black, gay with a white husband,
mm.
yet is like the lead fundraising guy for a Reform Party, which if he was in the 1930s Germany, I think, he would have been on the wrong end of a night of a long knives, I think, because he's too far off place.
Right.
And of course, at the moment, we have a black woman leader of the opposition. So we've had a Hindu prime minister
Mm-hmm.
who was sparring with a Muslim Scottish First Minister over referendum and devolution. So that puts, and a Pakistani at that. So that's put up Pakistan versus India thing quite into perspective relative to this week.
Yeah.
And the number two guy to Farage is not just a Sri Lankan brown guy, but a gay Sri Lankan brown guy who's
Mm-hmm.
swelled money, has got more money than Farage. And again, Farage is also pushing around the immigration problem.
Yeah.
And, you've got to be born in the UK, because obviously he's looking at his brown guy next to him, who was born in the UK, and it's like, so, okay, so what about Boris Johnson? Or just as likely, what about your wife, Mr. Farage, who's German national, and his kids have got German passports now because of it. They were on British passports, but now got German ones. I don't know where they live, but the Germans wouldn't give Farage a passport for himself. So I thought that was quite poetic justice.
Yeah.
And the thing, particularly with that section 4, chapter 4, whatever in the second book, keeping the rich, filthy rich, etc., etc., and then rent-seeking George Washington Plunkett, who's not George Washington, that's somebody else. There is, at the moment, a big push in London via Sir Sadiq Khan, because he got knighted in the last round of all the rest of it. He now wants to invade the London Greenbelt because the brownfield sites they've assessed is not going to be enough to build the houses they need. But it's always spoken about as housing, not as what you guys know as a condo, apartment block, stroke, multiple family dwellings, as opposed to single family dwellings that need much more space per person, etc., etc.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
So
the
there's
thing.
been
The semi-detached house never became a thing in America, really. In the 20th century, at least, after the Civil War. So
yeah, but we still have plenty of detached houses as well. Mind you, some of our detached houses are in several thousand acres, and so there's a couple of cottages in the garden, but you can't see them. So you think about like Longley or Chatsworth in places like that, but they won't bite the bullet about what we call non-dogs, as in people who have the right to reside but are not domestically resident for tax purposes. And a lot of these people have like 20, 30 flats and they just rent them out, and nor they are purely down as a tax dodge. So they sit empty. So, there's enough non-hotel bedrooms in London for everybody to sleep in a bed. And I think it goes that there's enough wardrobes for everybody to have a wardrobe. But I wouldn't swear to that one. But they still want to build more. And of course, the mere fact of building them, regardless of where they build them, is not such a great thing from a green point of view. Building's notoriously bad for energy and all the rest of it, and waste. And it's expensive to have a really good thermal envelope. They're not cheap, especially if you may want to test them to make sure how much they leak or not, as the case may be. And having done a few big offices, let's see how much this does actually leak, and then it's like, okay, now go find the hole. It's amazing how much stuff could disappear up a chimney without you seeing the chimneys, that type of thing. And the other similar thing, given we've now got a new Pope who seems to want to follow on from the old one for his green type, working class type credentials, we then get the relatively now Roman Catholic famous ex-Prime Minister, Tony Blair, because he was Anglican when he was in, because we don't have Catholic Prime Minister.
Right. So is the consensus that he was a crypto Catholic, or that he actually changed afterwards?
Well, officially he changed afterwards, but it's then a case of, well, it wasn't that long afterwards. So it's like, when did you have your road to Damascus type theatre? I don't know whether Cherie Blair was always Catholic. She might have been. But anyway, so of course he's now come up and criticised the net zero process. But he's criticised the criticism because apparently the criticism, as always, is going on the headlines more than the actual report that his institute put out. So that will be a read come soon. So, and then of course I saw what Pat put up about, oh, there's a summary and a analysis of 2025 project and all the rest of it, which looks intriguing. And the last week, I think Pat and I both put up a link about the same time to the project tracking website that tries to keep people aware of how far down the line we are.
Mhm. Yeah,
And
which I still haven't. This was my last week of classes, so I did not have a chance to really look at it yet.
with
But I have those.
within
I have those links.
yeah, so within this Ugar Sagon person's second group, aside from giving her a get out of jail free card for, are you trying to divide to conquer, as in you want to split something into a finer division? Okay, let's see the outcome of that, and be really careful of your why you want to do that, how you actually do that, how you deliver that, in the same sense of you know, lesbians and gays versus trans people type problem, whereby many people who would be supportive of sort of gays and lesbians on one side, for whatever reason, don't seem to want to understand that it may not be identically stated, but it's effectively exactly the same position, such that you end up with the likes of Aaron Turing taking poison because he's going to be nicked and sentenced and the rest of it, chemically castrated, because he ended up by cottaging in a public toilet and got caught early 50s, and it wasn't until I left school and I've been at work a couple of years that the age of consent in the UK for gay men was made equal to the heterosexual side. So when I was at school, it was 21. When I was at college, it was 18. And I think sometime when I was at university, it went down to 16.
Hmm.
But again, there was all the nuance of anybody more than 10 plus years difference. It would always be looked upon as being we might want to make a judgment about this arrangement.
Especially.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, well, and I think I think it is interesting the way she sort of tries to suggest that the situation is, but at the same time, I don't know if I'd say more complicated or more simple. It's different from the way that it's perceived, portrayed as being. She says some things about how, how working people don't necessarily want government spending to work the same way. That pretty much everybody she went around and interviewed, and again, it's anecdotal. It's a large, she talked to a lot of people, but it's still anecdotal, of course. That pretty she ended up concluding that people pretty much agree on healthcare, right? That everybody is in favor. All the people, all of the the second class people that she's talking to, the working class or the poor,
class,
but the underclass, right, are all in favor of that. Other things that that don't seem to have as much consensus around them involve whether if we are going to do something about government spending, where should spending happen and where should it be avoided?
So I mean, not having heard about her or the book, and given what you may or may not have read, where does she say that the divide line falls for education, government education?
Well, she says, I think that people who are working tend not to want handouts, which is, maybe kind of common sense, but seems to be kind of borne out in the the conversations, the interviews that she's done, that they're less enthusiastic about, sort of government programs that give money to people rather than sort of clearing the way for people to be able to work, or maybe to be able to save more of their, of the money that they earn when they're working. So lower, so reducing taxes. She's of course she's kind of a little bit of a Trump apologist, I guess. And so she was saying, well, yeah, the big tax cut that Trump did in his first term, actually the biggest gain percentage wise, although it wasn't the biggest gain in total dollars, of course, because the rich, the people who earn a whole lot more and get to keep a smaller percentage of it, get to keep a lot more money. But that there was a significant increase in the amount of take-home pay that working people had, by something to the tune of like 14%, she said, and that actually made a difference in kind of the working class support. And I guess her point was that it was much less about sort of the rhetoric and the sort of woke versus anti and all those things that end up in the news, and more about that, because I think one of the questions she was responding to was, well, how can religious people tolerate all of this personal chaos and infidelity and divorce and messing with porn stars and all of that happens in Trump world, and what she found apparently was that a lot of his working class supporters don't care about that, because he delivers what they're hoping he's going to deliver. So I don't know.
Well, I suppose in the century or two ago, British wise, there are so many people called Fitz something that we don't care about what the rich do with their private parts in private sort of thing. Although grabbing pussy in public might be one step too far. But then I played Crocodile Dundee, so but the other thing that I thought from the reading was the way that the capture of the tax system, which I think is the actual phrase used, both for people and for corporates. There is, and it seems to me to come back again to the $35 shoes versus $50 boots. The individual working class person has no spare money to be able to pay a lobbyist to ensure that the tax system is fair. And somebody else outside of a reading that came up within the context of general reading the last 10 days, one of the things stated about the UK is that there are millions of people, like maybe 10 million out of 65 million, who are on some form of benefit. And there are benefits that are not directly part of your effectively social security pension. That means everybody over 65 is on benefits, because there's no means testing for what we call the winter energy grant. So partly because prices for energy are outside the normal calculation for increasing or decreasing pensions, they make it a special supplement. And part of the way they pay for that is to take away supplements for, we're going to charge you the full price of a BBC license, so you can have a broadcast TV and a radio. Whereas that has other arguments that go on around it, because how much broadcast TV, other than it's the only way of paying for the BBC currently, although the BBC is quite a decent corporation in its own right, with all its overseas stuff and all the publishing.
I thought USA I thought paid for the BBC.
No, it doesn't. I mean, the BBC or BBC America, whichever way around it's called, doesn't pay for the British part of the BBC. We pay a license fee, and it's 100. It's effectively 170, £180 a year.
Wow.
And when I was a kid, you would have to do it. There would be like a surcharge on top, or if you had a radio in a car, even. And
Was there
there
a way
was
that you
a
could just sort of
lower,
prove that you didn't have a radio or a TV and not pay?
yes,
Oh, that's good.
and that applied to me, for instance, when I separated and then divorced the family.
Hmm.
You think I'm going to take the TV away from the kids? All they do is see that my name is the license owner, and then I
Hmm.
appear over there 40 miles away.
Yeah.
So I start getting stupid threatening letters from the BBC's agent. So
Good grief.
the nice thing there is there's a load of pressure groups, or quite a few pressure groups that are giving you information of how to beat the crap out of the BBC license,
Hmm.
which includes the fact that this is an official piece of paper that doesn't actually have a return address, and they're a corporation. So you've got a supposedly list of directors, but by the way, because they don't list the directors, here's a list of the directors for you and their telephone and
Hmm.
their postal address, home. And I got relatively lucky after like 3 years of saying I don't own a TV, piss off, got me up because they got really snotty about, well, you're never there when we come to check. Well, tough fucking luck. And at that point, I was in and out of Geneva and Oslo for some data center work. And I was in and out of West London for some other data center work. And that client has got a legal office. So one day when I was at the West London office, because they didn't have a legal department at the other site at that time, I thought, fuck this. I had the paperwork in the briefcase, stomped upstairs, and they said, who are you? I said, you're the local legal department. Yeah. Why? He said, well, I'm one of your consultants doing the thing downstairs for you. I need some help. Oh, what is it? So I laid out the paperwork and they said, don't worry, we'll sort it. And then I assume they did because 6 months later I'd moved again out to the Middle East. And the client at that time was Digital Broadcasting. So I turned them on themselves and said, look, I don't have a TV. I do watch it.
It's sort of unpatriotic, isn't it?
Yeah, I do watch a lot of television, but only after I buy the DVD, and I just binge watch seasons. But HBO, The Wire,
Yep.
Blown, which was a BBC HBO partnership, which they screwed up between them. And The West Wing and The Sopranos and Band of Brothers, none of which are true BBC publications. So up yours.
So we've got this.
It was the other thing that came up within the UK because of we're tracking all of the benefit people. The comment came up, if we can track the billions of these people that are somehow dodging and duping the benefit system, why are we not being able to track the 250,000 rich people that are dodging taxes because they're non-dom or they're based in the Cayman Islands or their lawyers have got a good turn of phrase, etc., etc., etc. And the number of times that it's like, it's that extra bit of money that you don't have attached to a need, but you can then turn around and say, I'll put this as an extra pension item. Can I do it out of Switzerland or can I do it out of the British Virgin Islands? And therefore evade and avoid British tax. Avoiding is legal, evading is not in the UK. And you see very, very little in the general press, which of course is published by the millionaires anyway, but of any of them getting done for tax reasons. And it's like, back to Nigel Farage, in his 2 employments back ago, he was done, inverted commas, by his employer for misrepresenting on his expenses to the tune of £35,000. So that's $180,000 a year. And all he got was a slap on the wrist, don't do it again. And then he changed jobs, so he didn't need to worry about it anymore. So the sheer, whereas if you were cheating on your BBC license, or you've managed to move around and your poll tax never caught you up, they would, when they caught you up, they would say, oh, you owe us 10 years worth of poll tax. The bit of money that you paid to your local council, that bids and cuts the grass at the parks, etc. And so the question I was going to put within the book structure was, you've effectively got 51 structures of tax plus cities and towns. So, and there's various instances where the schools don't get much money because people don't sell their houses very often, etc. In some states or in some regions of some states, because people don't move that much. And yet nobody seems to want to pay for schools any other way, etc., etc. So why are you not actually saying the system's broken, let's fix it?
Why aren't
such that the US?
Well, I think that we, at least where I live, we assess. I mean, it's not only home sales that that trigger reassessments. I think we have assessors, right, who come in all the time, and property taxes are always going up. So I think that I think the idea that the majority of education has been local. It's just been sort of overseen by this federal agency. But that's only from the 70s, right? Previously, it had always been local, and really even during that, the last 50 years, the majority of the spending has been. It's just been that there have been a bunch of requirements, some of them super useful, like civil rights and Title IX and all of these things, and others maybe less so, like No Child Left Behind or some of the other things that have happened more recently. But I'm not sure that is an indication one way or the other that and I'm not sure that that saying that the responsibility for this should be more, should be closer to the actual students is necessarily going to result in either a better or a worse endpoint. I don't know. What do you think about that, Mark? Can you hear us?
Hi, Mark.
No, we're not hearing you.
And you're muted, Mark.
Oh, okay. All right. I guess were we?
Okay, I got it. Sorry.
Oh, there you are.
Yeah, ask your question again. I was trying to get the audio to work.
Well, I guess I was saying something about the shift from kind of federal, Washington-based control of, of education to where most of the spending had always been. I mean, my point was that really all of the big budget items had always been more at a state level or a local level based on property taxes.
And that's, it's like property taxes, a smaller part typically from the state. And then, some of the title money, 3, 4, I forget all the numbers, that have to do with special education and stuff like that. They come from, the national level, but that's relatively small. I don't know what prompted this discussion. There's always been a big issue state by state related to private alternatives and does the money follow the kid or what happens in those situations. And I don't know, that has become, I think, more and more part of the national debate too on the funding of K-12.
Yeah. I when I lived in New Hampshire, we had no state income tax, I guess. We had property taxes like crazy, but even so, the state didn't fund the state universities.
No,
So University of New Hampshire was like the most expensive public school you could go to, in the early 2000s when my daughters were looking at my older two were looking at colleges. It was ridiculous.
to some extent, one of the big issues, well, I know in North Dakota, it was about the colleges, state colleges were about 30, little over 30%. And part of the big issue was, and I think it's always been, you don't pay much, but you can exert a good deal of control if you want. And that, I guess the all alternative of what you were describing when the state doesn't pay much. And then, of course, I think, tuition then has to will likely go up. And,
Mhm.
some logic to that, of course, is, well, it's your kid, you should pay or they should pay. And I don't know, there's always an argument for that as well.
Well, and I think that is a lot of that has maybe taken the spotlight off actually the cost and the benefit and kind of messed up that calculation.
And I think that's all related to bigger questions of what especially higher education, and to some extent K-12 is for. If you see higher ed as a vocational kind of thing, well, you know, as opposed to something different. And I do think that's part. I don't know how spoken it is, but the whole question of what is the purpose of this all,
Mhm.
and therefore who has to pay, is always part of the argument back and forth at all levels.
Well, yeah, and it does seem like there has been, I mean, all the way back to, when we were talking about, Hutchins and Adler, right? There was an idea that, that civic participation required some level of engagement with
Right.
kind of humanities and critical thinking and all of that.
Yep.
But it does seem like since then there has been this, and especially in the last generation or so, there's been this shift to the point where it's actually, we're becoming part, the objective has been to become part of this, coastal intelligentsia,
Yeah.
I mean, and it almost sort of parallels the shift of journalism from being kind of a blue collar, working class profession to being this, very elite, kind of inside baseball, you don't get to talk to anybody unless you can show that you're from their social set and, and can play in that, can play those games.
Sure. I mean, that argument, what I would call the what's it for, is even extended now, and it's being really pushed by the, research component
Mm.
and what that's for, and therefore who should pay for it. And, again, it's one of those things of, is it a general benefit? Is it a benefit at more basic levels?
Mhm.
Because again, the vocational component, things that will be funded and developed are not general and they're not basic. And we're in that period of a lot of these discussions, I think, are going on from people who don't buy into the big picture explanation.
So,
And,
so,
the ramifications could be decades
Yeah.
to rebuild if you don't really believe basic research and general liberal arts education is
Right.
important or necessary. I don't think, how do you, and you take all the money out of that, how do you ever turn that around?
Well, it's interesting. It's too bad Chris isn't here to talk about math because I think a similar, there's sort of a similar thing. There are very few people who are, well, there aren't, maybe I shouldn't say very few. There are a small number of the people who study math are ever going to go on to become
Right.
physicists or mathematicians or engineers and actually use, differential equations. But even so, it would seem like it would be useful for everybody to understand, to be numerate and to understand the way, especially things like statistics work. right? And so it strikes me that there's
East toward
that's
Woodale
sort of the
Drive.
missing link between, are we I mean, all of the community colleges are so totally focused on kind of the vocational endpoint that, and they are, I think, and the one that I work at right now in St. Paul, I think I haven't paid attention because I'm sort of only, contingent, but they are talking about really changing. The Minnesota state system is talking about, I think, really changing the transfer requirements to four-year programs. And really, I think that the gist of it is that they're thinking about really reducing the humanities element and, kind of going down from, 3 or 4 required humanities courses to maybe one. And what that's going to do to English departments, history departments, any other, whatever arts and other programs are left at all, which are kind of few and far between anyway. So it's going to be interesting to see. I mean, it does seem like we're getting to. I mean, we're almost kind of stripping it to this point of saying, well, there's only so much we can afford, and so we have to. I mean, that hasn't that been kind of the gist of the argument or the excuse for a lot of these things?
I was thinking back. I think it was quite common in the election before Trump got his first time around, was you didn't build that on your own because we built the road, etc. We built the infrastructure. But with a number of instances, you can see that you've not been looking after the infrastructure, so they're in a shit state, and you've got a big bill coming all at once. Similar in the UK, and things like we sold off the water utilities on the basis they would invest in providing more water, which they have done because they charge for it, but they haven't done reciprocal type investment into the sewage system because they don't charge for it directly. And therefore, we don't have sewage capacity to stop.
The water comes in, but it can't go
out. Absolutely. I mean, here at the commercial rate, it's about $2.75 for a cubic meter of potable water, and then you pay about 30 cents of the same number to take it away, and partly because of the water park and all of the landscaping that allows us, we kept on trying to say that half, roughly, of our water doesn't go down the sewer, it goes into the swimming pool or into the irrigation. And because your local plant can't cope with the chlorine level from the swimming pool, you want us to do all of the fish tanks, of which there are a considerable amount, and the pools, of which there's like 45,000 cubic meters. So the cubic meter is well over 10 gallons. So lots goes out with my sea water pump stuff. So you don't see it in the sewage, but they wouldn't budge. And so the UK is now, there's a couple of instances where ex-CEOs and current CEOs of water companies are in court to say, well, you and your investors are going to have to cough up the money because you had the profit. Now you're supposed to have paid investment into sewage and you haven't. So therefore, and it's always that. I mean, one of the things I've found it, the thing that I was talking about, where there's all these line items for it's not clear on where or exactly what condition it is, but there's a total of dollars equivalent per annum for things like PBS, NRA, museums, minority business development, entrepreneurship, exporting more goods overseas, American manufacturing, community policing, programs for women, due process, civil rights, blah, 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 blah. There's a whole pile of them. It's like $24. And the comment the bottom line comment is I have no problem with paying for these, but now give me back the $5,109 that the War Machine
Yeah,
charges me every year,
right.
and the other $800 that is corporate welfare for Big Oil and Walmart.
Mhm.
As in, they're the biggest US only employer, and yet they're the biggest employer of employees who claim food stamps and benefits because they're not paid enough.
Right.
So
Right.
it's that type of mismatch that
Yeah.
I was trying to get to. And yes, I know that the US Social Security is not government money, it's money you paid. In the UK, that's national insurance because it's taken at source in most cases. And that's also where the chapter on tax in the book starts to say the IRS gets paid by your employer if you're a salary slave anyway. So why are the IRS looking at employees rather than all those people that have got other money and or are the employers, etc., etc., etc. And you just don't see that number of instances of the screaming of that person should be in court at least, never mind in jail, etc. And it's the we don't quite have the same minimum wage type problem in the UK, but it's like if a corporate is benefiting from the fact that we, the people, are paying some of the people, one, why are the people still shopping there? As in, use your money to vote. You know, where you spend your money is up to you to an extent. But then it's like, where do I buy my $35 shoes because I can't afford a $50 boots? Problem anyway.
Well, I think that
As in,
I think to use again education as an analogy, right? There are a bunch of different sort of layered, either rhetorical or actual reasons, right? There's obviously a bunch of kind of anti-intellectualism, right? The I love the poorly educated kind of a perspective in politics. But then there is that sort of privatization element of it. But then then the thing that I was more, I was curious about is, is this thing really about sort of triaging based on affordability? Like, oh, there's a limit to the number of things we can do. Everything is so expensive now. But again, to what you were saying, Tim, it's like, well, okay, $24 went to all of that stuff that I actually like. $5,000 went to this other thing that we were not allowed to talk about. And so we end up instead having these weird conversations in this little world down here in the $24 world about wokeism versus anti-wokeism and campus protests and all of that kind of stuff, which seems like it is kind of evading the actual discussion. Right. There used to be a bumper sticker that people that libs used to have out east that said, wouldn't it be great if if the Defense Department had to have a bake sale or something like that, and the schools were fully funded.
yeah, I mean, there is of course that famous Will McAvoy entry speech out of Talking Newsroom, and it's we're America is top in three things: incarceration of citizens, the number of citizens that believe it, whatever it was about the ark or whatever on the Bible, and the most amount of money spent on supposedly defence. And in that context, okay, Hawaii got bombed, but nobody's ever actually in
Invaded
recent
America
times
since 18.
invaded America. Yeah, like it's
Been over
one of the other things.
210 years. Yeah.
One of the well, there's been terrorism attacks, but there've also been terrorism attacks not on US soil and all the rest of it. And one of the things that also popped up was in the UK, of course, particularly for London, the kids were all evacuated. Now, it clearly wasn't as bad as you incarcerating all of the Japanese ethnic people in the West Coast, including Lieutenant Sulu and
Yeah.
co. But
Good old Lieutenant Sulu.
yeah, well, somebody did a meme thing that passed partly because of one of the bits I quite like is the Zulu Wars.
Yeah.
There's a clip that they've shown from the Zulu film. Yeah, Michael Caine's big first break.
Oh, not the more
And,
recent.
it's yeah. Well,
What does Michael Caine say about the Maxim guns in the Zulu Wars?
I
Glorious.
don't. Well, in the Rorke's Drift position, there wasn't any, and there wasn't any Iswanawana, which was the day that day of the day before, where the 10,000 Zulu took over what was left behind of number one column, 1,500 plus.
Okay, so it's a little
That just got massacred.
Yeah.
But and I think in that particular instance, all of the firepower went off with Chelmsford to go find them, and they just missed. They sort of went round the wrong way round the hill, and then of course there was no defences put up by the column camp because it's a bunch of savages. What do they know? And they learned the hard way. So about 1,500 people got wiped out in the morning, and the people that went to Rorke's Drift were some of the reserves that didn't get any sort of bloodlust satisfied. So they went looking for, and Rorke's Drift was right on the border. So there's a thing from Kitchewayo, the Zulu king, saying, you almost went into our neighbour, that you shouldn't do that. So they got called back. So that's also why in the end of the film you see them all raising their shields and walking off into the sunset and not fighting on the bulk of the second day. But there's the thing with the US, we're bigger spenders on defence than the next 27 countries, 26 of whom are allies. It's from the original speech. Now, not so sure, because in theory, Russia's not an ally, China's not an ally, and they're climbing up that totem pole fast. And what's the Cold War saving element that we aren't doing? And
that we haven't cashed?
well, one of the British historians that does quite a bit of 20-minute shorts on bits and pieces, mostly military, mostly World War II, World War One, but not exclusively so. Recently did 4 or 5 on the state of the British armed forces. He hasn't done one on the RAF, but it turns out we've got more ceremonial horses than we've got battle tanks.
Ceremonial horses?
So there's 500 odd ceremonial horses for the Blues and Royals, like the Royal Guard that you see on Tribute of the Colour.
Yeah.
And the horse artillery that is only ceremonial. And there's something like 350 serviceable tanks on tap. But also, one of the Navy he did is we've actually got more admirals than we've got battleships of any kind.
Perfect.
So you're right down to sort of corvettes and motor torpedo boats, and you still haven't run out of admirals. So captains have got no promotion route, as it were, until they start dying off. I haven't seen what he's done on the RAF yet, but I'm sure there will be one eventually.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, and I guess that's a question. That was at the beginning of this administration. When all of the talk, the first time that the vice president went to talk to the Europeans, right, and then there was a lot of talk about how Europe was going to kind of pull themselves up by their bootstraps and actually start spending some money on their own defense. And not just sponge off the American NATO spending. That was kind of a weird moment, though, wasn't it? Because
I don't know, given the amount of stuff we've donated off to the Ukraine, I don't know whether we have replaced things like the battle tanks we sent with new or placed orders for new. But I also know we don't have a big desert somewhere full of partly, you know, mothballed tanks and planes waiting to be unmothballed, like you're now doing again with your B-52s.
Oh, we do.
But
Yeah,
you're not
there
down.
is. I mean, but those
Yeah,
things,
yeah, yeah.
they're the youngest of them are 50 years old.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're about to get British
Yep.
Rolls-Royce engines.
Can't build them. Can't build them
Go
like
for
that.
another 20 years.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
And
yeah.
and a refit of all their electronics and all the rest of it. So, but it's the amount of boondoggling stroke bulk that you get out of the 5,000 for the military machine
Mhm.
seems to be, it's a good employer, it's a good training employer, or at least it used to be. It's obviously quite good for industry because, you know, Boeing, Lockheed, and all the rest of it, almost every state has got something out of it,
Mhm.
even if it's only a few bases to become missile range or whatever. When you talk about the likes of Montana and Utah, because they're clearly not no naval bases.
Yeah.
But you know, Area 51 still got to go somewhere, sort of thing. And there's clearly at some point, if you started to dig into that, you end up with, oh, if you keep going along that line, you cross over a national defence type red line drawn in the sand, all the rest of it, such that we can't answer the next question, but we can answer this one, sort of thing. And you wonder how the man in the street clearly cannot understand and is not expected to understand. So it's not really discussed. I mean, the closest you get to it, I suppose, outside of the serious drama type stuff, would be something like Charlie Winston's War, as in, how can I cheat and fund the Afghans against the Soviets successfully? Because the system's so big, I can get away with running under the doorsteps or the gap in the doors, etc., to leak all this money.
Mhm.
And then it's a case of somewhere in the UK recently has come up a bit like your woman looking at the two halves of the working class and the unworking working class sort of thing, or the poor.
Mhm.
Where's the actual do a shapely energy flow for the money? Where's it going? What's it doing? How much does effectively those on a, I don't even know you have it anymore. I'm pretty sure there's not that many in the UK, but a weekly wage, not necessarily cash anymore. So it's not necessarily in a brown envelope you pick up on Friday afternoon.
Mhm.
But there certainly used to be when I was sort of doing work in and around, you know, the end of my high school and stuff and college. How many of people at that age are, what portion of their tax bill
Mhm.
stroke, we're taking some benefits away because you've just got over the threshold. So there's, you know, for every pound you earn, you lose a pound of benefit.
Right.
Where's it go? Where, what does it get spent on? As opposed to it just disappears into this huge mixing bowl and then comes out and you're not allowed to know where it goes, etc. When how much is actually the NHS worth? How much of that is salaries, operational expense,
Right.
purchase of equipment versus who owns the land? Because I know a
Well,
number of
and it would
hospitals.
seem like that would be that information would be possible to pull out of some type of database if there actually were a will to find that. I mean, that's the whole kind of the disappointing element of that whole from the perspective of if anyone, if you believed that it was going to do something, the whole Doge thing, right? That they were gonna find waste, fraud, and abuse, or they were gonna find, and I thought it was really, I thought that would, sort of zero-based accounting, or for kind of first principles, sort of approach to, well, where is the money being spent? What is it being spent on? Does it still need to be spent for that? And instead they found, transgender mice experiments and woke, and anti-woke stuff that they could grab some headlines with. I think the disappointment of that, to whatever, to whatever extent, anybody believed that it was gonna do any good, was that they were gonna actually find something of substance and be able to communicate it in a way that people would understand beyond just those kind of headline grabbing moments. It seems to have had its kind of 15 minutes of fame and gone away.
Yeah, and it's like as you say, the transgender mice is, from my reading, is just another version of their eating the pet.
No, but to what,
whereby whoever said it first, whoever whispered in certain people's ears so that they then repeated it, because clearly they didn't read the science papers themselves, because they just don't do that sort of thing. How did they misunderstand? I mean, there was one recent one up in the climate sphere where there's now one paper out of China that has shown that 4 particular glaciers in Antarctica have put on ice mass over the last 3 years.
couple
After
of meters.
15,
Yeah.
after three decades of continuous loss.
Yeah.
And that the last, they do it like a dogleg graph of a loss.
Mhm.
The loss rate at the largest rate is something of the order of 170 gigatons per year. And the gain rate over the last 3 years on these 4 glaciers was like 104. So there's still a net loss.
Mhm.
Even if this finding on these 4, because the model they've used seems to add up more points rather than take some more summaries from somewhere else. It's instantly grabbed by the anti-science, anti-woke. Look, the ice is not melting. Well, yeah, it is, because you didn't read paragraph 2 of the journalist version. Whereas if you just read the abstract, because it's behind the paywall, the actual paper, the old nature. The abstract says that we think there's an accounting error. We've rerun the numbers, and therefore these 4, they don't say that. And that's the other annoying thing, is they don't actually say on the basis of these 4 how many other glaciers are in Antarctica, because obviously, depending on how they worked them out, I mean, the one thing that I thought was, wow, that's surprising, and we've partly touched on it here in a couple of instances where, so how would you rearrange the states, and what would be the constituency shape of the sides? And from an environmental point of view, one of the ways of trying to manage that is by watershed. Yeah. So the downside of that is, if you go to the point of where the sea and the rivers meet, 40% of the continental United States goes out through the Mississippi.
Yeah.
It's rather a big state.
Well, and if you, and if you look, I mean, globally, everybody lives in river deltas, right? So I mean, as a percentage of total global population, everybody lives either along rivers or or on the coast, and generally, the most people live at the ends of rivers. And so, how do you, again, is that really the best way of?
Well, it's just, I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying it's a way that has been proffered
Right.
as being a way. And then when you then try and let's draw the lines without too much gerrymandering, you say, oh shit, we've got this supersized state in the middle of the US called Mississippi.
Yeah.
It's
Oh,
40%.
it's interesting though, because you can't really say that, that people in St. Louis have the same priorities as people in New Orleans,
No, but it's the same.
or
It's the same.
Bemidji. I mean, Bemidji's on the Mississippi. It's
Yeah.
only 2 feet deep there, but
Yeah.
so that is, yeah, that's problematic. But the other thing is, what about, I mean, it's ironically, it kind of reminds me of what's his name, James C. Scott said in The Art of Not Being Governed when he was examining Southeast Asia, and he said, the Zomia is all of the land above whatever he said, 1,000 meters, right? So this whole, I mean, and it crosses all kinds of borders, but all of the upland territory is much more similar, and the people are much more similar than the cultures that are down on the, in the harbors, at the river deltas, on the coasts. And those are where the civilizations are. And the other place is where everybody goes to escape the civilizations.
Look, I mean, it's rather like you were talking, Patrick piped up earlier about the medieval class structure and serfs. That's where the Black Death was a useful thing, because that was the great item that picked up
Made
wages.
labor valuable. Yeah.
Yeah. And then it's also within 100 years of that stopping being a day-to-day worry as opposed to an annual worry, because the annual worry went all the way up to mutant, etc. Because that's one of the reasons why he was hiding away in Cambridge, getting away from London, because of the plague was back in one of its usual cycles. Is where
and then London burned down.
City of London at least.
The following year. Yeah.
1666 and all that.
Yep.
It's odd because 1066 is when we started speaking French, and 1666 we were. By then we'd already started only speaking in English.
Yeah.
So there's the.
Well, it's also funny before you go on. It's also funny. I was talking to Pat just as you came on about, I want to read about the Hanseatic League, and I was looking at these books that Grok suggested to me, and I noticed that one of them ends at like 1348. So apparently the boundaries of the relevance of it wasn't all about the Hanseatic League, but it was about, sort of the Baltic region and the North Atlantic and all of that, and it ends at the Black Death. So I thought that was an interesting period.
So there's that, I forgot what is, David Gideon, the Jewish guy that lives in France but teaches English and does the English history language, mostly videos on Let Them Watch TV or something to that breaks. His latest one was on, so what did Black Death do for England? The Black Death made English the language of court. The royal court, the parliament court, and the judicial courts, such that prior to that, you had to either plead your case, if you were lucky, in Latin or in Norman French. And so there was another, poor people don't speak that, they don't write, they don't read.
Right.
So they don't have access to justice the way we think of it now. And of course, therefore, the Magna Carta, really, as good as it was, is very much, this is a barons versus the king thing, rather than.
Well, kind of like the first Reform Act, yeah. It didn't really extend much of the franchise to many people.
No. And so there's and he comes up with the language changes, the education change, because obviously at the Black Death, there were only 2 universities, Oxford and Cambridge. And there, the bulk of our classes were in Latin because it was almost exclusively clergy. In spite of the fact they were doing medicine, astronomy, astrology, etc., not just divinities.
Right.
But the courts moved, because of who the bosses were all Norman French, French. And of course, there was, Plantagenet by empire still about, and then Agincourt and Cressy and all that sort of stuff. So there was an awful lot of input across the channel, despite the fact we'd lost Normandy relatively early on. But that came over as
right. And those Normans were originally also Norsemen. So
yeah.
So this whole
Well, I mean,
13th, 14th century North Atlantic story, kind of feeds into that as well. So yeah, I think
it also came up on a Welsh history blog post where they were talking about Harold Goodwinson and Herstich doing a pincer movement against the Welsh princes to try and get Wales earlier than they actually did, and how that worked, and the actual invasion. This is where it gets really stupid. They did it twice, a bit like, if you've lost Agincourt, how the hell did you lose Cressy, whichever way around they were? Because it's an almost identical battle. How could you be so stupid to lose, two of the same?
Right, weren't paying attention.
But the Welsh almost lost twice for exactly the same. A few years later, I can't remember which one of the Edwards or Henrys it was, but they came and did a north and south thing. And rather like Cyprus, which has got a green line between the Turks and the Greeks, there's a green line in Wales that runs basically from sort of Chepstow, Bristol, out to Haverfordwest, which is on that little bit that pokes out furthest to Ireland to the south. And below that line, lots of places got proper English names as their normal name, and virtually everything north of it is all Welsh.
So Bristol's kind of right on the edge, though, isn't it? Was Bristol?
Bristol is on the edge, such that Bristol docks are on a side river from the River Severn, and across on the far side of the River Severn estuary is Wales.
Okay. Well, I thought it was the Avon. It's the Severn. Okay, sorry.
The Avon goes through Bristol and Bath, for instance, and goes underneath the Clifton Suspension Bridge. It's a deep gorge, relatively speaking, the big tidal mudflat, and that's the tributary that comes out on the Severn, which has got huge mudflat tidal stuff. But on the far western side, you've got a little bit of England, Chepstow, basically, and a sliver. And then from there, west and south is Wales. So you've got Newport, Cardiff, Swansea, and so on as the big cities. And you've got all the coal mining valleys are just north of that.
Okay.
But the Severn is much of the border. But once it goes inland a bit into the English countryside, then the English-Welsh boundary is often shown by a 400 or 500 AD Offa's Dyke. So there's a hand-dug ditch and mound that used to have a wooden fence, a Norman type wooden vault type things, towers. And that was Offa's Dyke, so OFFA.
Yeah, I remember that. When I was enthusiastic about King Arthur. I remember Offa's Dyke.
Yeah, well, in theory, that's the other thing. In Gideon's talk about English versus French chivalric romances. So the Arthurian legend was originally Norman French, was like the last big one that was pointed at the English. And the next big thing in literature was Canterbury Tales in English.
Yeah. Interesting.
So
apparently there's a story though that I read today as I was kind of digging into this little rabbit hole that Arthur went to the North Pole. I always knew that
Well,
there was a story that the Welsh had gone to High Brazil, on the, west of the Atlantic. But this, I just ran into this one that was reprinted in an anthology of Arctic exploration stories in the 1880s that said Arthur went to the North Pole.
are you sure that wasn't on the,
That was
he
who?
bummed the seat on the Nazi moon, far side of the moon base, or
Uh,
whatever.
I don't know. Apparently,
Uh,
it was pre Geoffrey of Monmouth. I don't know.
but
But
there
it's weird.
was,
I mean, there are so many weird little stories actually, and I was thinking maybe I should actually read some Richard Hakluyt because he apparently ran around and tried to pull together all of these legends and stories and fables about navigation
well,
and seagoing exploration and stuff.
rather like you said about, there was the story that you touched on with people going to these islands that we don't have names for and all the rest of it.
Oh,
Gideon
Friesland, yeah.
spoke, Gideon spoke about a French romantic story that had sort of Atlantis type disappearing places in as well. But I don't think he even mentioned any heavy dragons type thing. But I'm sure there probably would have been if there was a sketch map somewhere.
Yeah.
But as we say, you go to the final big plague in London, the Great Fire,
Mhm.
Samuel Pepys, Newton
Right.
time.
Right.
You've also got Daniel Defoe and
Yeah. Right.
all the Gulliver's
All
Travels and
his
all.
all his pirate stuff too, yeah. But apparently there were also a lot of stories about English fishermen and also English merchants going to Iceland. So there are all these stories from the 15th century of people going, John Day from Bristol and a guy named
Well,
Crotchet.
that I could believe, given all the stuff that's about Henry Cabot and
Yeah.
etc. And of course, Henry Cabot isn't Henry Cabot. He's not English.
Giovanni Caboto.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And his son, yeah, and then his son Sebastian. Yeah. Well, and so Bristol is really interesting, but apparently the fishermen were coming from Hull. So they're up in Yorkshire on the other side. And
Yeah, they're on.
and they're sailing
Yeah,
north into to fish cod first around Iceland. But then there's a rumor, and the thing that Mark Kurlansky uses in his book about the cod is he says that the Hanseatic League blocked at least the Bristol English, if not all of the English, from trading in Iceland in 1475. And so his theory is that then they went looking for the island of High Brazil in 1480-ish, to find a direct source of the codfish that they wanted, or stockfish as they called them. But and then there is a letter supposedly written by Columbus, possibly to his son Diego, about how in 1477 he sailed 300 leagues to the west of Thule, or Thule he calls it, which is Iceland apparently. And so he's up there too, which that was what I was that it took like 5+ minutes for Grok to kind of chunk through a deep search or whatever they call it, to kind of chunk through all of the sources. It found like 54 sources and then gave me some type of an opinion on this 1477 Thule letter of Columbus's, which is not published anywhere. It's not part of his extant writings, but apparently something that it was talked about in other. I mean, we have so many of these lost books or lost records or lost writings that are talked about in other sources. But you can't, there's a limit to how much you can consume.
and/or they're in the back room of the Vatican Library. Only looks at them.
Not that, yeah, haven't been found in 200 years. Yeah, yeah.
Well, that would be, in terms of given we got a new pope who's a bit of an academic, degree in maths and all the rest of it, that would be quite a big redemption step forward if he opened up the library
Digitize
more than it is at the moment.
That would be interesting. Yeah, yeah. Who knows who knows what we might find?
Absolutely, yeah. All the missing gospel threads.
Oh, well, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. All
Yeah.
that, not to mention epistles that we don't want to come to light.
Well, yeah, Magdalene's gospel would be a good one, wouldn't it?
Oh yeah, that was in the Nag Hammadi set, wasn't it? The Gospel of Mary Magdalene and the Gospel of Thomas. I think a bunch of those were.
Yeah, there's a bunch, and it was somebody was trying to restate some things along the lines of something in the Old Testament was true, and they really didn't like it. So when I popped up to them, which translation to use? When I needed to check something, which might have been that Sorkin ripoff of the talk show about can the Washington Redskins play football? Do I have to stone my brother for putting two blocks side by side, etc.? That stolen missive they use in the Westmouth. It might have been that, but it might have been something else. And so I ended up with doing a general search for the words that I knew, and it came back with the quote. I thought, okay. Then I scrolled down, and it had 625 versions. And some of those were literal translations with other languages. So that this is the translation that's in the Armenian Standard Bible of 1500 or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
So it was all in English, and most of them had no material change within that particular couple of versions. But we had one of the engineers I worked with in Bristol, and I was finishing up with Arab, the consultancy. He decided to go off to whatever the Baptist or the Methodist do for their priestly colleges, and so he got a present from us to leave. And one of the things he couldn't afford up to that point was a full concordance of the New Testament. As in the standard Anglican New plain English language from the King James Version into everyday English, but a concordance index. And it's like 3 times the size of the Bible.
Oh yeah.
Because it goes backwards, forwards, sideways, up, down, and reverse sort of thing.
Yeah.
And it's at that point you suddenly realise the complexity stroke interrelationships almost such that there's the usual one that I can't remember what the number is, but it's like 30,000. Every now and then you get people say, oh, but the Old Testament and the New Testament are 2 different things. And it's like, yeah, but there's 30,000 references in the New Testament back to the Old Testament. So they're hardly separate.
Yeah.
It's like,
yeah. So we're out of time. So shall we just finish both books next Saturday? I think I'm.
Are you still here, or are you?
I will be. Yeah, Saturday. I'll be going in midweek. I'll be going up north, but I'll be coming back. And then Saturday I will be here, and then Sunday I jump on a plane for Vienna. So yeah, so we could do it on Saturday morning. And then we'll have to take the following week off. So that'll give us time to figure out what it is we next want to read and get started on it.
Yeah. So you're doing Eastern Austria. You're not coming back into Innsbruck or anything.
We are going. We're landing in Vienna, and we're going to drive west along the Danube to Dürnstein and Linz and Salzburg, and then down to Hallstatt and Gmunden, and then back around in about 9 days. 10 days.
Okay, so you don't get out into the tail all the way out to Tyrol. You just about miss that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, have fun. And
thank you.
So try not to play the third man music too often.
Okay, fair enough.
or the horse song when you're in Linz. They really don't like that.
Yeah, we'll bring. I'll have my phone, so I'll be able to make a little playlist. Yeah. All right. So see you next week then.
Okay. Do we know where Chris got to today?
I don't know.
I didn't see any message.
I didn't see it, but I didn't really look for it either. So yeah, he'll be able to catch. I'll post this. I didn't say anything that I'm embarrassed by this time around, I don't think. So I'll post this and we'll go from there.
Oh, before I meant that if we had 5 minutes before Pat turned up or Chris turned up, I was going to say that I didn't think I was that hard on you, and as Chris then carried on with playing the devil's advocate as a statement, as opposed to playing the devil's advocate, that was all I was doing. It wasn't.
Yeah.
I really wasn't having a dig. It was a case of I don't know enough, so ask the stupid question, see what falls out, basically. And,
and it's kind of funny because generally that has been sort of where I've sat too. And so I am getting, and Pat, you're right. I have not been, I don't have TV, so I don't actually watch any network, but probably more of the stuff that I have consumed on YouTube has been not so much Fox News, but certainly the new podcast universe of popular MAGA, kind of adjacent folks. So yes, I mean, and that's the thing is all the facts, all the filter bubble, control or influence on just even the data that you get exposed to is just extreme nowadays.
So is this not a prescription to do, I don't know, Heather Cox on Fridays just to get some sort of reset? Not necessarily do it every day, but do it on Fridays. Given your relationship with her and all that.
God. Yeah, that is well, and I guess the one nice thing about what she does is she does, give a very elaborate and thorough list of her sources for kind of her summary of the news, which I think, the other thing that I did do actually was I did subscribe to Ground News, which I haven't really had a chance, I've been busy with the end of the semester and I haven't had a chance to really, kind of go in there every day and say, okay, what's the left talking about? What's the right talking about? What is nobody talking about? But that's what it purports to be able to do.
Yeah.
So I'll assess that too and see if that helps me out at all. And
yeah, I'm looking for a user to say that it sort of works, even if it steers you around some of the silos.
Yeah.
But without a obvious, we're going this way, as opposed to these are the trees that we missed and these are the trees we hit. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things that is interesting about it is it gives you sort of from left to right the columns of media that have reported on kind of a general topic.
Well,
I didn't find anything that that really grabbed me yet that I thought was like, oh my God, I gotta spend an hour digging down, drilling down into this. But at least that reassured me a little bit that I guess nothing major had happened that I wasn't aware of, which is something.
Just the election of the Pope.
The election of a Pope. Everybody was talking about that. It was kind of funny because the podcasters, because they go, they produce their thing and then it drops the next day. That's been one of the areas where they've been the most sort of out of date, right? Because it hasn't, where the black smoke. It's like by the time I watched it,
and yes, it could be literally the next round of smoke could be white. But there was also, as I said earlier, there's the Alistair and Rory, and the rest is just politics. Their normal hour is the last two was one before the Pope and one before the fisticuffs with India and Pakistan, and then the next one was after.
Mm-hmm.
And in one of the two, Rory brought up the People's Assembly and the Swiss Confederation stuff, but also pulled up that, particularly when he's walking around places, he often sort of bangs on the door of an abbey.
Mm-hmm.
Says, give me a room for the night.
Hmm.
And how often the lead abbot is voted for by the other brother. So how democratic, as opposed to being appointed from the Vatican or whatever, actually is.
Okay, I just found The Rest is Politics. I don't think I've ever watched it before, but I'm gonna put it on my list of things to take a look at.
Yeah, I think even I'd stay away from the shorts.
Okay.
because almost all of them are just slices out the bigger conversation.
Okay. Yeah.
Uh,
I usually don't love the hot takes.
Yeah, that YouTube doesn't help that.
Right. Right. Okay, cool. Well, then next week we just finish both
Yeah.
and pick a new book. So I'll
Yes. I mean, we ought to make sure that everybody else.
Yep.
And I also
I'll put an
tried
announcement
to
in the community notes about that.
I also tried to get Trace back.
Hmm.
She's not been using Obsidian that much. She's been using, I think she says Pepperpot. So she's wondering whether she can still get access to the remote.
To the vault? Oh yeah, sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I can message her. I've got her in my.
So she might just need a bit of somebody giving her a bit of a yank. I don't know. See you next week. Have a break.
Have a good week.
Ciao, ciao.